You took hits that would have made most people disappear, and somehow you're still standing there like the damage forgot to finish the job. That's the part nobody understands. They see the smile, the silence, the way you keep moving, and they assume it was easy because you didn't collapse in front of them. Funny how people measure pain by what they can see. If you cry, they understand. If you break down, they believe you were hurt. But if you suffer quietly and keep functioning, suddenly everyone thinks you're fine. They don't see the nights you questioned yourself, the moments you wanted to quit, the disappointments you swallowed, because there was nobody around to explain them to, or the times you had to rebuild your confidence while pretending nothing had changed. You survived things that could have completely rewritten another person's identity, and yet you're still here, still thinking, still learning, still trying, still refusing to let one terrible chapter become the entire story. But don't romanticize the damage. Pain isn't a superpower. Suffering doesn't automatically make you stronger. What matters is what you did after the damage. You learned. You adapted. You became more careful with your trust, more serious about your boundaries, more aware of your time, and less willing to waste your life proving yourself to people who already decided what they wanted to believe. That's what they don't understand. They think resilience means never getting hurt. No, resilience means getting hurt without allowing the injury to become your identity. You can be wounded and still move forward. You can be exhausted and still take one more step. You can lose people and still refuse to lose yourself. And maybe that's why your strength looks strange to people who only recognize power when it's loud. Yours may have been built quietly, in moments nobody witnessed, through choices nobody applauded, through every time you could have become bitter, but chose to keep your mind open, every time you could have given up, but decided tomorrow deserved another chance, every time life gave you another reason to believe you were finished, and you answered by continuing, not because you were invincible, but because somewhere inside all that chaos you discovered something more valuable than invincibility, the ability to recover, adapt, and keep becoming someone the damage was never designed to create. While everyone else is still trying to understand how you survived what they thought would erase you, you're already learning that survival was only the first part of the story. And the real question is what kind of person you decide to become with everything you manage to carry through the fire. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can make it dark, cynical, psychologically intense, and sharply provocative. There are things people go through that don't leave visible scars, and that's probably why the world underestimates them so easily. People look at you today and see someone functioning, talking, smiling, working, moving forward, and they assume the past couldn't have been that bad. Of course, because apparently if you can still answer a message, go to work, laugh at a joke, and walk into a room without falling apart, then nothing must have happened to you. That's how shallow people can be when they measure pain from the outside. They didn't see the moments when you questioned whether you could keep going. They didn't hear the thoughts you had, when everything felt heavier than it should. They didn't watch you rebuild confidence after someone destroyed it, or learn to trust yourself again after circumstances made you doubt every decision. They saw the finished version and missed the construction site. But surviving something doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It means the pain didn't get the final word. Maybe there was a period when you thought you were finished. Maybe you lost someone, lost an opportunity, lost your confidence, lost a relationship, lost money, lost direction, or simply lost the version of yourself you thought would exist forever. And when something important disappears, the mind immediately starts asking questions that don't have easy answers. Why me? Why now? What did I do wrong? Will I ever feel normal again? Those questions can become a prison if you live inside them forever. Eventually, you have to ask something different. What do I do next? That's where survival becomes strength. Not because the suffering magically made you better, but because you refused to let it decide everything that came afterward. You learned things you didn't want to learn. You discovered boundaries you didn't know you needed. You became more careful about who receives your trust. You learned that some people only love the version of you that is convenient for them. You learned that promises mean very little without consistent behavior. You learned that your peace has value. And perhaps the strangest lesson was discovering that you could survive losing things you once believed you couldn't live without. That's a powerful realization. It doesn't make you emotionless. It makes you less easily controlled by fear. Once you've survived something that once looked impossible, the next challenge doesn't look quite as terrifying. You still feel fear, but you know fear isn't a prophecy. You still feel pain, but you know pain eventually changes. You still experience disappointment, but you know disappointment isn't the end of the road. That's resilience. Not pretending you're invincible. Not walking around acting like nothing matters. Not turning yourself into a cold machine because you think emotions are weakness. Real resilience is being honest enough to admit that something hurt and disciplined enough to keep building anyway. While the people who underestimated you remain focused on the person you were during your weakest moment, you begin focusing on the person you became afterward, because survival changes your standards, your priorities, and sometimes even your definition of success. And suddenly things that once seemed important become strangely small. Approval becomes less valuable. Unnecessary arguments become less interesting. And the need to explain yourself to everyone begins disappearing, because you have already learned that not every person deserves a front row seat to your life, and not every opinion deserves a response, and not every loss deserves to become a permanent wound. While the world keeps moving as if nothing happened, you quietly carry the evidence that you survived something difficult and discovered abilities inside yourself that comfort never would have revealed. The patience to begin again, the courage to make decisions while uncertain, the discipline to rebuild when motivation disappears, and the awareness to recognize that your life is still yours even after something tried to convince you otherwise. And maybe that's the part nobody expected. Not that you would never get hurt again, but that you would become harder to destroy because you learned how to recover, how to adapt, how to stand back up without pretending you never fell, how to remember the lesson without worshiping the pain, and how to continue forward without needing the past to become beautiful before you allow yourself to have a future. Because what happened to you can be part of your story without becoming the title of the story. And the damage can explain some of your scars without defining the person carrying them, leaving you with something far more valuable than the illusion of invincibility, the knowledge that even when life takes something from you, even when people disappoint you, even when circumstances force you into a version of yourself you never planned to meet, you still possess the ability to choose what happens next. And that choice becomes more powerful every time you make it deliberately, every time you refuse to surrender your identity to an experience, every time you decide that surviving isn't enough, and that you are going to use what you learned to build something better, stronger, calmer, and more honest than what existed before, while the scars remain as reminders rather than commands, and the past remains behind you rather than sitting in the driver's seat. Because you didn't survive all of that just to spend the rest of your life proving how badly you were hurt. You survived so you could eventually discover how much life was still waiting for you after the damage, how much strength could be built from the pieces, and how much of yourself was still there underneath. Everything you thought had been destroyed. Damage has a strange way of teaching you things that comfort never bothers to explain, because when life is easy, everyone thinks they understand themselves. But when everything falls apart, that's when you discover what was real and what was just a convenient story you told yourself. The difficult moments expose weaknesses you didn't know existed, but they also reveal abilities you never had a reason to develop. Maybe you trusted too quickly before. Maybe you ignored warning signs because you wanted to believe someone was better than their behavior. Maybe you avoided difficult decisions because staying comfortable felt safer. Then life forced you to confront what you had been avoiding, and suddenly the lesson arrived without asking permission. Pain became information, failure became feedback, disappointment became a mirror. Not a pleasant mirror, obviously. Nobody enjoys looking at the parts of themselves they'd rather keep hidden. But growth rarely begins with compliments. Sometimes it begins with an uncomfortable realization that says, "You can't keep doing this." And that's where experience starts becoming valuable. You begin noticing patterns. You recognize the kind of person who talks beautifully but behaves terribly. You recognize situations that drain you before they become disasters. You learn that an apology without changed behavior is simply another performance. You learn that not every opportunity deserves your attention, and not every person deserves unlimited access to your time. That's what difficult experiences can give you when you refuse to waste them. They sharpen your judgment. They don't make you perfect. They make you more aware. You become slower to react and faster to observe. You stop making decisions based entirely on how something feels in the first 5 minutes. You start asking what the consequences will be tomorrow, next month, or 5 years from now. That's a different kind of intelligence. It isn't flashy. Nobody gives you a trophy for avoiding the same mistake twice. But your life becomes quieter because you stop creating unnecessary chaos. You stop chasing people who repeatedly show you they don't want to be caught. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided to misunderstand you. You stop treating rejection like a verdict on your worth. And perhaps, most importantly, you stop believing that every painful experience has to be erased before you can move forward. Some things don't need to be forgotten. They need to be understood. You can remember what happened without living inside it. You can acknowledge the damage without allowing it to become your identity. You can carry the lesson without carrying the bitterness, while the people who only see your present life may wonder why you're more cautious, more selective, or less easily impressed than before. They don't understand that you're not becoming colder, you're becoming more informed, because experience has taught you that appearances are temporary and patterns are revealing. And once you've been fooled by something, you become much more capable of recognizing its shape the next time it appears, not because you're paranoid, but because you've collected evidence. And evidence changes the way you think, while the past becomes a teacher instead of a prison, showing you where you need stronger boundaries, where you need better preparation, where you need more patience, and where you need to stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. Because every difficult chapter can either become another reason to stay afraid, or another piece of knowledge you use to build a smarter future. And choosing the second option doesn't mean pretending the pain was good. It means refusing to let the pain be useless, taking what it taught you and leaving the unnecessary suffering behind. Learning how to recognize red flags earlier, how to protect your energy without becoming selfish, how to trust without ignoring evidence, and how to recover without needing everyone who hurt you to understand what they did, while your experience quietly becomes part of your strength, not because suffering automatically makes someone wise, but because reflection turns suffering into understanding. And understanding changes behavior, and changed behavior changes outcomes, allowing you to walk into situations that once would have overwhelmed you with a different level of awareness, knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to leave, when to negotiate, and when to stop wasting energy on a battle that was never worth fighting while every old mistake becomes less of a source of shame and more of a reminder of how much you've learned since then. Because you are no longer the same person who made those decisions, and you don't need to punish your present self forever for what your past self didn't know. You simply need to make better choices with what you know now, turning damage into experience, experience into judgment, judgment into discipline, and discipline into a life that doesn't repeatedly demand the same painful lesson. While the world keeps giving you new challenges, you keep meeting them with information earned the hard way, carrying forward the lessons without allowing the wounds to dictate every move, and slowly discovering that the things you once considered proof of your weakness can become evidence of how much you've learned, how much you've adapted, and how much more difficult it has become for the same kind of chaos to control you twice, because once pain becomes understood, it loses some of its power to confuse you. And when confusion disappears, you can finally see the road ahead without constantly turning around to argue with the road behind you, allowing everything you survived to become knowledge you can use, rather than weight you have to drag, while your future begins benefiting from lessons your past was forced to learn the hard way. People love the idea of being strong until strength stops looking glamorous, because real resilience isn't standing in the rain with a dramatic expression while pretending nothing hurts. Real resilience is much messier. It's waking up on a morning when your mind feels exhausted and still deciding to get through the day. It's admitting that something broke you for a while without allowing that broken period to become your permanent identity. It's saying, yes, this hurt, instead of performing some ridiculous version of toughness where you're supposedly unaffected by everything. You don't become stronger by lying to yourself about pain. You become stronger by understanding it. There is a difference between weakness and exhaustion, between surrender and needing a moment to recover, between being hurt and being defeated. Sometimes you need to stop. Sometimes you need to cry. Sometimes you need to admit that you don't know what you're doing. None of those things erase your strength. In fact, refusing to acknowledge them can make you weaker because you're spending energy pretending instead of healing. The people around you may not understand that. They may say, "You're still upset," as if emotions have an expiration date printed on the bottle. They may expect you to move on because enough time has passed, according to their calendar. But healing isn't a performance for other people's convenience. You don't owe anyone a perfectly timed recovery. You owe yourself honesty. If something hurt you, acknowledge it. If someone betrayed you, accept that it changed how you see them. If you made a mistake, learn from it without turning self-criticism into self-destruction. That's what resilience looks like when nobody is filming. You don't deny the wound. You stop feeding it. You don't pretend the past didn't happen. You refuse to let it dictate every decision. You don't become emotionless. You become capable of experiencing emotion without allowing every emotion to become an instruction. Anger can tell you something mattered, but anger doesn't have to decide your next move. Fear can warn you about risk, but fear doesn't automatically mean stop. Sadness can remind you that you cared, but sadness doesn't mean your future is finished. This distinction matters because many people confuse emotional suppression with emotional strength. They bury everything, act unaffected, and then wonder why they feel disconnected from themselves years later. That's not resilience. That's unfinished business wearing a confident face, while genuine resilience allows you to feel what happened and still choose what happens next, allowing you to recover at your own pace without constantly demanding that the pain disappear before you start living again. Because sometimes the goal isn't to return to who you were before the damage. It's to become someone who understands themselves better because of what happened, someone who knows their limits, recognizes their needs, chooses healthier relationships, and stops treating suffering as proof that they must tolerate more suffering. While other people may admire your ability to keep functioning without ever realizing how much discipline it takes to keep moving when motivation has disappeared, because resilience isn't always a giant comeback. Sometimes it's answering one important message, completing one small task, taking care of yourself, asking for help, or simply refusing to make a permanent decision during a temporary emotional storm. And those small choices eventually become evidence that you can trust yourself again, because every time you survive a difficult day without destroying your future, you're rebuilding something inside you. Every time you choose patience instead of impulsiveness, you're strengthening control. Every time you choose recovery instead of revenge, you're proving that pain doesn't own you. And every time you allow yourself to be honest about how difficult something was, without using that difficulty as an excuse to stop growing, you're becoming more resilient in a way that doesn't require an audience. While the world continues expecting dramatic displays of strength, you quietly develop something far more useful: the ability to bend without completely breaking, the ability to rest without quitting, the ability to feel without drowning, and the ability to continue without pretending everything is perfect. Because perfection isn't the goal, progress is. And progress sometimes looks like moving forward with uncertainty, scars, doubts, and unfinished emotions still sitting beside you, while you learn that being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone. It means knowing when to carry it, when to put it down, and when to ask someone trustworthy to help you carry what has become too heavy, allowing yourself to remain human without turning humanity into an excuse for permanent surrender, and eventually recognizing that the strongest version of you may not be the person who never breaks down, but the person who understands how to rebuild after the breakdown, how to learn after the failure, how to recover after the loss, and how to keep moving without becoming ashamed of the fact that you were hurt in the first place, because pain is not proof that you are weak, and needing time does not mean you have lost. It simply means you're human, and resilience begins when you stop demanding that strength look like invincibility and start understanding that sometimes strength looks like surviving the day honestly, then waking up tomorrow and choosing to try again. The past has a nasty habit of showing up uninvited, especially when you finally start building something better. Because the moment life becomes quiet, your mind sometimes decides to replay every mistake, every betrayal, every rejection, and every moment you wish you could rewrite. It's almost impressive how the brain can turn one uncomfortable memory into an entire documentary series nobody asked for. But here's the problem. Remembering what happened isn't the same as living there. Your past can explain why you think the way you think, why certain situations trigger fear, why you hesitate before trusting someone, or why you sometimes expect disappointment before anything has even happened. But explanation is not destiny. What happened to you matters, but it doesn't automatically determine what happens next. You can acknowledge the past without handing it control of the present. Maybe someone betrayed you before, so now you expect everyone to betray you. Maybe you failed at something important, so now you avoid trying because failure feels like proof that you're not capable. Maybe someone rejected you, and you've quietly decided that rejection means you're not worthy. That's how the past becomes a prison. Not because the events themselves are still happening, but because you're allowing old information to make every new situation guilty before it even begins. That's not protection. That's punishment. You're punishing your present for something your past experienced. And eventually, you have to recognize the difference between learning from history and being controlled by it. Learning says, I know what happened, so I'll make wiser choices. Fear says, I know what happened, so nothing good can ever happen again. One creates awareness, the other creates limitation. You don't need to erase your memories to move forward. You need to stop treating them like instructions. If a relationship ended badly, that doesn't mean every future relationship will end the same way. If a business attempt failed, that doesn't mean every future attempt is doomed. If someone underestimated you, that doesn't mean you should spend your life trying to prove them wrong. Sometimes the healthiest response is to stop giving old people and old situations permanent influence over decisions they no longer have any right to control. While you begin separating who you are today from who you were during your most difficult moments, because the person who made a mistake years ago didn't have the information you have now, and the person who trusted the wrong person didn't necessarily have the experience you have today. So why keep demanding that your present self pay forever for what your past self didn't know? You can learn without humiliating yourself, remember without reliving, and acknowledge without remaining trapped. Because growth isn't pretending the past never happened. It's using what happened to make better decisions without allowing it to become a prophecy, while other people may continue defining you by an old version of yourself. You don't have to participate in their outdated description. You can change your habits, your environment, your priorities, your relationships, and your standards. And eventually, your life will provide evidence that you're no longer the same person, not because you announced your transformation, but because your choices became different. And different choices create different outcomes, while you stop asking whether you're still the person who was hurt and start asking who you're becoming now. Because that's the question that actually has power, not what happened yesterday, not who betrayed you, not who rejected you, not what mistake you made, but what you're going to do with the knowledge you have today. And once you focus on that, the past becomes a reference point instead of a destination, something you can look at without needing to return there, something you can learn from without allowing it to dictate your identity. While every new decision becomes an opportunity to prove to yourself that history doesn't have to repeat itself simply because it happened once, allowing you to trust carefully without assuming everyone is dangerous, to take risks intelligently without assuming failure is guaranteed, to love without demanding certainty, and to pursue goals without needing an old version of yourself to approve of the attempt. Because your future doesn't owe the past a reenactment, and you don't owe yesterday another performance. You owe yourself the chance to experience something different, make different choices, and become someone whose life is shaped more by intention than by old wounds, while the memories remain where they belong, behind you, carrying lessons but no longer holding the steering wheel. Because the past may have written some of the earlier pages, but it doesn't get to decide every page that comes next, and every time you choose differently, you prove that the story is still being written. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can make it dark, cynical, psychologically intense, and sharply provocative. There is a dangerous moment after you've survived something painful, when you start believing the pain is the most interesting thing about you. Suddenly your story becomes a list of everything that went wrong, who betrayed you, what you lost, how badly you were treated, and how much you had to endure. And yes, those things matter, but they are not the entire story. You are not the betrayal. You are not the rejection. You are not the failure. You are not the person who walked away from you, the opportunity you lost, or the chapter that nearly convinced you to stop trying. Those things happen to you, but they don't own you. That's an important distinction, because the human mind loves identities. Give it a wound, and it can turn that wound into a personality. Give it one failure, and it can build a whole philosophy around why trying is pointless. Give it one betrayal, and suddenly everyone becomes suspicious. Convenient, isn't it? The brain thinks it's protecting you, but sometimes it's simply keeping you trapped in an old story because the old story is familiar. Becoming more than what happened to you means refusing to let familiarity become destiny. It means looking at everything you've survived and asking a different question. Not why did this happen to me, but who am I becoming because I survived it? That's where the power shifts. Maybe you became more disciplined. Maybe you learned to recognize manipulation. Maybe you discovered that your boundaries were too weak. Maybe you learned how valuable your time actually is. Maybe you realized that you can survive being misunderstood without begging everyone to understand you. Those are changes worth keeping. But you don't need to keep the bitterness that came with them. You can keep the wisdom and throw away the poison. That's real growth. You don't have to become cold just because someone treated you badly. You don't have to stop loving because someone broke your trust. You don't have to stop taking risks because something failed. You don't have to spend your life proving that the people who underestimated you were wrong. Imagine building your entire future around proving something to people who aren't even paying attention anymore. That's a strange way to give them control. Your life should become evidence of your values, not a revenge project designed around somebody else's opinion. Build because you want to build. Improve because you want to improve. Heal because you want peace. Learn because you want understanding. Succeed because success matters to the life you're creating. Not because someone from your past needs to regret losing access to you. While the people who expected your pain to define you begin realizing that something much stranger happened instead, you changed. Not into a perfect person, not into someone who never struggles, but into someone who understands their own value more clearly, someone who can recognize pain without worshiping it. Remember betrayal without becoming obsessed with revenge, and acknowledge failure without treating it like a permanent identity. Because becoming stronger doesn't mean becoming untouchable. It means becoming more capable of recovering when life touches the places that still hurt. And that's why your scars don't need to disappear for your life to move forward. They can remain reminders without becoming instructions. While you continue building new experiences that have nothing to do with the people or situations that once hurt you. Creating friendships that aren't based on old patterns, pursuing goals that aren't connected to old validation, and making choices based on who you are now, rather than who you were when everything fell apart. Because the past may explain some of your fears, but it doesn't get to choose your ambitions. And your wounds may explain some of your caution, but they don't get to cancel your curiosity. While every new step becomes proof that your identity is larger than your history, that you can carry lessons without carrying limitations, and that survival can become the foundation rather than the ceiling, allowing you to build a life where the difficult chapters are remembered but no longer dominate the conversation. Where your achievements aren't apologies for what happened to you, and your happiness isn't a performance designed to make anyone jealous, but simply the natural result of choosing yourself repeatedly, choosing growth when comfort would be easier, choosing honesty when denial would feel safer, choosing discipline when excuses would be more convenient, and choosing to keep becoming even when you haven't completely figured out who you're becoming yet. Because you don't need a perfect explanation for everything you've survived before you're allowed to move forward. You only need enough courage to stop letting the past write instructions for a future it will never have to live. And once you understand that, you can finally look at everything that happened without asking it for permission to become something better, leaving the damage where it belongs while carrying the wisdom forward, not as a prisoner of what happened, but as someone who learned how to turn experience into direction, pain into awareness, and survival into a reason to keep building a life that belongs to you.